Good evening. Welcome to Reading Grounds. Tonight it is May 19th, 2019. If you're watching the stream, feel free to pop into the chat and say hello, leave a comment, or whatever you'd like. Last time on the stream, we read about Philip K. Dick, the author with a funny name. We read his short story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which is the basis for the cult classic movie Total Recall. And we also talked a little bit about memory and how that pertains to identity. Welcome to the stream, Tyler. Thank you again for joining us, as always. Let's take a look at Wikipedia's front page today. Today's featured article is Homer Davenport, a political cartoonist and writer from the United States, known for drawings that satirize figures of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, especially Ohio Senator Mark Hanna. Although he had no formal art training, that is, Homer Davenport, not Mark Hanna, he became one of the highest paid political cartoonists in the world. He was also one of the first major American breeders of Arabian horses and one of the founders of the Arabian Horse Club of America. He studied and drew the Arabian horses exhibited at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. In 1904, he drew a favorable cartoon of President Teddy Roosevelt that boosted Roosevelt's election campaign. The president in turn helped Davenport in 1906 when the cartoonist required diplomatic permission to travel abroad in his quest to purchase pure desert-bred Arabian horses. The 27 horses Davenport purchased and brought to the United States had a lasting impact on Arabian horse breeding. Now that's interesting. I don't think anybody grows up, or as a kid wants to grow up to be a political cartoonist and a horse breeder, but sometimes it happens. In the news lately, in the Ibiza affair, a political scandal causes the collapse of the Austrian government and triggers a snap election. The Liberal National Coalition, led by Prime Minister Scott Morrison, wins the most seats in the Australian federal election. Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei dies at the age of 102. On May 20th in history, it is the Day of Remembrance in Cambodia, the National Day in Cameroon, Victoria Day in Canada, the National Awakening Day in Indonesia. In May 20th, 1570, the first modern atlas, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, by cartographer Abraham Ortelius, was issued. In 1609, Thomas Thorpe published the first copies of Shakespeare's sonnets, possibly without William Shakespeare's consent. In 1983, a team of researchers led by French virologist Luc Montagnier published their discovery of HIV, but were not then certain that it caused AIDS. In 1993, One for the Road, the series finale of American television sitcom Cheers, was watched by 42.4 million American households in its original airing. Wow, that's a lot of people. It looks like Kimmery and Shelby are back for once. Thank you for joining us for the first time in about 8 years. So Shelby texted me earlier asking that if it'd be possible to start streaming at an earlier time. So I think next week I am going to start streaming an hour earlier. That should work out for me anyway. Because I've actually started waking up. Normally, for a while now, my alarm clock has been set for 8 in the morning, regardless of the day of the week. However, this week I started to roll it back and started to wake up at 7 in the morning, which means that basically doing this stream, and in order to get a full 8 hours of sleep, I would need to basically get off and go to bed as soon as it was over. assuming we go the full 2 hours, of course. So by doing this, not only will it be more convenient for everyone else, I should think, um, who seems it seems like everybody's waking up earlier these days, um, but also it will allow me to be able to do whatever it is I need to do after the fact, and won't have to worry about just going straight to bed. Oh, and speaking of going straight to bed, tonight was the final episode of the Game of Thrones television series. I've not watched it. Tyler's telling me it hasn't been a very good season, which is really unfortunate. Because in speaking to Tyler, I was looking up some of the I had talked to him about a story point and asking him if that was at all in the show, and I don't think it was. So I looked it up, and I remembered just how much I envy A Song of Ice and Fire. George R. R. Martin is a master of his craft and incredibly imaginative, and I can only look on in vast amounts of envy. But we're not here to be depressed, even though many of us are. Instead, we're here to talk about things. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, we've got a lot of things that we could talk about. Um, Lately, I've been thinking about starting a blog, which is generally recommended for aspiring authors. Um, I talked to Shelby about this. I think because a lot of blogs, I don't really like them. I think they're either just like too personal to be of any use to anyone but the writer, or they're just, I don't know, not particularly interesting. I thought that it might be better to do a blog. I had this brilliant idea that perhaps it would be better to start a blog, but to also do something a little simpler and not to put too much thought into it, but just put some content out there, something that people could potentially be searching for or find, and something that could help them get a better idea of the kind of person that I am. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to build up a backlog of posts and then queue them up and then start a blog and probably link to it on here and then link this podcast on there. Figure all that jazz out and decide where to go from there. But essentially, I'm going to be just talking about probably movies mostly, and then occasionally books or ideas in fiction. Sort of like what I do here, except a little more specific, I suppose, rather than just faffing about like I do here. Kimmery is saying that Emilia Clarke is her celebrity lookalike. I would agree. Emilia Clarke is my celebrity lookalike. I look just like her, which is why I can't get a date. But that is neither here nor there. Well, I don't really have a plan for tonight. Um, I think, however, I might read a little bit about Niccolò Machiavelli. Oh man, I hope I'm spelling that right. I'm probably not. Let's find out. Niccolò. I'm just going to copy paste that. There we are. That looks nice. Now, Niccolò Machiavelli was an Italian diplomat. Um, He was also a politician, a historian, a philosopher, a humanist, a writer, a playwright, and a poet of the Renaissance period. He was born May 3rd, 1469, and died June 21st, 1527. He's often been called the father of modern political science, so you know that he's a very, very interesting person and not somebody who would just put you straight to sleep. For many years, he served as a senior official in the Florentine Republic with responsibilities in diplomatic and military affairs. He wrote comedies, carnival songs, and poetry. His personal correspondence is renowned by historians and scholars. He worked as secretary to the Second Chancery of the Republic of Florence from 1498 to 1512, when the Medici were out of power. He wrote his best-known work, The Prince, or Il Principe, in 1513, after having been exiled from city affairs. Um, his name is synonymous with Machiavellian, which is a general term used to refer to somebody who manipulates the public in order for political power. Not simply that they, not necessarily that they beef themselves up, but that they will do anything that they can to gain power and to attain it. They will disregard their own morality, all for the sake of power and control over people. A lot of people have accused Niccolò Machiavelli of uh, um, really giving sort of a sowing the seeds of tyrants and tyranny and abuses of power. That he was the one that was kind of responsible for it. That people used him as a sort of guideline to how to base their empire. So people consider him to be a generally negative person. But the more interesting thing about Niccolò Machiavelli is that it- he's not necessarily a villain in that sense. Um, because while people do attribute uh, his writings to giving people power and giving them ideas on how to abuse people and their methods, the reality is that Niccolò Machiavelli wrote The Prince, his book, not as necessarily um, condoning abuses of power, but about warning against them and being sarcastic and uh, doing it as a sort of means to satirize and underline really just how bad these abuses of power were. Um, Machiavellian theory, ideals, whatever you want to call them, they're usually seen sort of as a. It's usually summarized as being the ends justify the means. That no matter what, as long as your results are good, the methods don't matter. Which, of course, is a tantalizing idea. It doesn't matter the idea that it doesn't necessarily matter who you murder or torture or imprison, just as long as you bring peace to the land. But that only sounds good in theory, because when you don't consider morality and you don't actually weigh your judgments, uh, when you can't see the forest for the trees, as it were, you worry only about the result. You will step on toes and slit throats, even of innocent people, and you won't have any regard for them or the people who care for them. Trying to see if I have any particular quotes from him that might be interesting to read. Here's one that seems to summarize. It says, "A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study, than war and its rules and discipline. For this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules, and it is of such force that it not only upholds those who are born princes, but it often enables men to rise from a private station to that rank." Saying that war belongs to the people that rule rather than to the people themselves, aka the people who are affected by it. There's a line in Game of Thrones, or perhaps just in the books, where it's something like "It is the small people who suffer when the lords play their Game of Thrones." I think is how the line goes, or something along those lines. Um, I had thought about even reading The Prince on stream. It is, however, boring even for this stream, and it might be. It's one of those things that's probably better to read rather than to simply speak about. Something to really mull over and consider and study. Unfortunately, I don't know much about, excuse me, about politics or political theory, so I can't speak entirely about it. I don't think. Not particularly good at it. Certainly not as prepared as I should be. Um, let's see here. As far politics and satire and things like that go, I'm better with satire, I suppose. But politics are kind of beyond me because I'm kind of a simpleton and I don't like to get involved. Politics are just such a quagmire that you can't really see. I really can't tell the beginning from the end. It's just this complete sort of impossible Gordian knot of opinions and mire and half truths and fabrications and emotional reasoning. So I tend to avoid politics generally. But I'll read you a little poem by William Blake, who was, I should say, because he's long dead, an English poet, a painter, a printmaker. If you've ever seen, uh, if you've ever seen or read Red Dragon, which is the Hannibal Lecter story, um, that's a plot that centers around a William Blake painting called Red Dragon, and he's an interesting figure, very surrealist, very kind of grim. but this is one poem he wrote. It's not particularly long, but it kind of talks about politics a little bit. So this is The Grey Monk by William Blake. He says, I die, the mother said. My children die for lack of bread. What more has the merciless tyrant said? The monk sat down on the stony bed. The blood red ran from the grey monk's side. His hands and feet were wounded wide. His body bent, his arms and knees, like to the roots of ancient trees. His eyes was dry, no tear could flow. A hollow groan first spoke his woe. He trembled and shuddered upon the bed. At length with a feeble cry he said, when God commanded this hand to write, in the studious hours of deep midnight, he told me the writing I wrote should prove the bane of all that on earth I loved. My brother starved between two walls, his children cry, my soul appalls. I mocked at the rack and grinding chain, my body bent mocks their torturing pain. Thy father drew his sword in the north, with his thousands strong he marched forth. Thy brother has armed himself in steel, to avenge the wrongs thy children feel. But vain the sword and vain the bow, they can never work war's overthrow. The hermit's prayer and the widow's tear alone can free the world from fear. For a tear is an intellectual thing, and a sigh is the sword of an angel king, and the bitter groan of the martyr's woe is an arrow from the Almighty's bow. The hand of vengeance found the bed to which the purple tyrant fled. The iron hand crushed the tyrant's head and became a tyrant in his stead. So that's another political work, that little poem. I'll see if I can find a bit of political context for it. But it's essentially about how there's this idea that might makes right, essentially, which is Machiavellian. And even though Niccolò Machiavelli himself would have been opposed to that, as far as we can tell, certainly people have adapted that. And it's a very primal, basic instinct that if you want control, the main idea to follow through with that is to just be violent and coercing and to force people to do your will or to pressure them. Um, it's about obviously, pain and suffering, usually by the innocent. Um, the mother is dying, her children have died of starvation by the tyrant's order. Uh, the monk is being tortured. He's restless. He can't sleep. Brothers are starving. Children's cry. Um, but vain the sword and vain the bow. They can never work war's overthrow. The hermit's prayer and the widow's tear alone can free the world from fear. Um, the second to last stanza, for a tear is an intellectual thing, and a sigh is the sword of an angel king, and the bitter groan of the martyr's woe is an arrow from the Almighty's bow. Essentially saying that suffering in stride is better than trying to meet violence with violence. And that by enacting violence in the last stanza, the iron hand crushed the tyrant's head and became a tyrant in its stead, saying about how by being strong willed and by being forceful like that, you essentially put yourself in the same shoes as those people that you opposed, who oppressed you, and that made your life a living hell. Call it the cycle of abuse, the cycle of violence. Um, Again, there's a very specific historical uh, point of reference for William Blake's painting his poem, The Grey Monk. Um, but you don't need to know that to enjoy it. You don't need to know anything about William Blake to enjoy it. which is the mark of a true classic, is that it's timeless. So, speaking of Game of Thrones and that such, Game of Thrones is really interesting because of this sort of thing. I say Game of Thrones only because that's easier to say than A Song of Ice and Fire, which is what the books are called, technically, the series. The only one that's called Game of Thrones, technically, is the first book and then the show. The show decided to call it Game of Thrones, A, because that's the first book, and B, because it sounds better. It's better to say. Um, and if you really want to get pedantic, especially now, because the show deviates from the books a bit, it's in some places more than others, and but um, so if you wanted to be specific, you could refer to the books as just Song of Ice and Fire, and the show as just Game of Thrones. Um, However, I'm probably just going to keep saying Game of Thrones just because it's easier to say that for me than it is to keep saying Song of Ice and Fire, which is a bit of a mouthful. Also, for the record, if you wanted to refer to the book, if you wanted to be really specific, the book is a Game of Thrones, not just Game of Thrones. They all start like that. A Game of Thrones. The second one is A Clash of Kings. Third is A Storm of Swords. Then A Feast for Crows, and then A Dance of Dragons. If you care at all. So here's the interesting thing about Game of Thrones, and Song of Ice and Fire, and the story as a whole. Um, Game of Thrones. I'm gonna spoil it. I don't know if anyone cares, but at least the first book. It starts off. Um, the story's not about the king. It's not about the prince. It's instead about the king's friend. This guy by the name of, Eddard Stark. That's really embarrassing that I couldn't remember his name. Who's confronted, who is visited by his friend, the king, who asks him to be made the king's hand, which is basically like his second in command of the whole kingdom. Um, Eddard Stark is a really nice guy. He's very noble. The first we see of him is that he executes a guy, but he doesn't do so necessarily out of vengeance. He doesn't do so to be cruel. He does so because it sets a precedent. Because he knows that he needs to be a man of his word. Um, he executes the guy himself instead of appointing a headsman or an executioner, specifically because he believes that the quote is something like, "The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword." If you can look a man in the eyes and you cannot kill him, then perhaps that man does not deserve to die. Very noble, very worthy, and he makes his sons watch this execution to set an example to them. So Eddard Stark is a really good guy, but as the story goes on, he ends up getting. Well, I'm just going to spoil it. He gets executed as part of a coup and basically, even though he's an innocent man, he's a good person. He would have. He. I'm sure it happened in the show as well. I know in the books, at least, that he was willing to. They said, we'll let you go. We'll let your family, live in peace as long as you do this thing. As long as you go to the wall and live your life there. And he says, okay, I'll do it, not for my sake, but for theirs. And then he gets turned on by the boy king who succeeded his friend, um, the boy king Joffrey, who ends up executing him to try and make an example of him. Now, this sets a precedent because you don't expect Eddard Stark to die. It's a very uncommon thing in stories. You don't expect your protagonist to just be killed in cold blood like that, especially not when he's, a paragon of virtue. He's a nice guy. He's got a family. He's even willing to, sacrifice the rest of his life for his family just to make sure that they're taken care of. Instead, he gets murdered in cold blood, and his family gets persecuted, branded as traitors, and this whole other mess. And the thing about The Song of Ice and Fire is that compared to other fantasy novels, it's very realistic. You might call it low magic, high realism. There's a whole slew of terms out there. Um, but whatever the term is, the point is that it's very realistic. It's it has a lot of real world precedent in it. George R. R. Martin, even though he's now known for this fantasy series, he mostly did science fiction in his day, which is considered to generally be, what would you call it? It's a more down to earth thing. Fantasy is very fantastical. It's very, it's less about realism and more about telling a story or even just having fun in this imaginary world. Science fiction generally though, I mean it depends, but there is this expectation that there will be a certain level of realism to it. That there will be some verisimilitude to your world. And George R. R. Martin, by making his story realistic, what he really did was he was commenting on the real world. He's saying, this is what people are like. In real life, good people die. Just because you're heroic doesn't mean you live. In fact, if you're a hero, you're probably going to die. In fact, there's a really good line in the first book. Eddard Stark is imprisoned. He's going to be executed shortly. But this guy that he knows called Varys comes in. He says something like, what does he say? I'm drawing a blank, and that's really embarrassing. Basically, he says something about how there aren't very many people like Eddard Stark that aren't as noble as he is, and he looks around his cell and sees how dark and desolate it is. He says, and when I look at your situation, I see why. That's not in the show, unfortunately, but it's a great line. So George R. R. Martin, he's really, 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 really good at pulling the rug out from underneath you. You sit there and you think, oh, this is going to happen. Eddard Stark's going to be let loose and, whatever. Instead, he pulls the rug out from you and checks your expectations. He says, get over it. This is a realistic story. It's not going to have fairies and unicorns and magic in it. It's just a bunch of angry people killing each other over politics, just like real life is basically what's going on. And it's heavily based on history. George R. R. Martin took a lot of inspiration from a historical event called the War of the Roses, which is this English war. Very interesting if you ever have a chance to watch a documentary or something on it, especially if you're a fan of this series. You'll look at it and you'll just be like, man, George R. R. Martin just ripped that off. Stuff like Margaret d'Anjou, who is the inspiration for Cersei, I believe, Cersei Lannister, except the real life Cersei, Margaret, she was very capable. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the point is that it's a kind of a slap in the face to fantasy, and not a bad one, but like a wake up call, where you have this story and it's like, well, real life is not a story. Real life is cruel and it doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care how noble you are. You will have your actions and they will have consequences. End of discussion. That starts to change, however, at the end of the first book. when Daenerys Targaryen, who is the last of her line, gives not gives birth, that would be really weird, but she has these three dragon eggs and they've never hatched. They've been there. They're basically just decoration because they've been around for hundreds of years and never hatched. Daenerys takes them into this big fire that reasonably should have killed her. Instead, it just burns all of her hair off, and these dragons hatch from it, and she becomes the mother of dragons, Khaleesi, or whatever. And so her family used to be the noble line. They're the Valyrians, the very fancy pants, white haired. We rule this bee, and there's nothing you can do about it because they alone commanded dragons, at least until the dragons went extinct, and then Robert's Rebellion happened, and that was all before the Game of Thrones. Basically, the Targaryens are deposed. Dany's the last one. Now she has dragons, which they have not had for years, and this is the first fantastical part of the story. And like I said, the interesting thing about this is it's not simply the fact that George R.R. Martin is realistic, because there are a lot of dickheads out there that will write a story and they'll be like, oh, it's realistic, and it's just terrible. Like, it's just really grim and dark and not that interesting. George R.R. Martin, though, is much more nuanced. He's a lot more complicated. He doesn't just do realism like you think. There's this line that really sets the tone, which is where one character is talking to another one, and they're talking about like magic or wolves or something like that. And he's like, oh, do you believe in, grumpkins too? Like these stupid imaginary creatures. And you don't know what a grumpkin is. You've never heard the legend, but you hear that and you understand, okay, magic isn't real. This is a low magic, high realism fantasy setting. This is, it's a political story. But again, we learn at the end of the story that actually dragons are real, and that ends up being important because when the dragons are born, we later learn that causes magic to basically reappear in the world, or at least be strengthened. Because the thing is that George R. R. Martin is really good at pulling away your expectations. A character is introduced at the beginning of the second book named Melisandre. And she's this mysterious priestess from this strange religion that we don't really know anything about. And she's introduced, how she's introduced is that she's poisoned, and it doesn't faze her. She's not sickened by it. She even knows that it's happening, and it just doesn't bother her at all. And so slowly, piece by piece, George R. R. Martin begins to introduce all these magical artifacts and magical happenings and all these mystical orders and all these strange things. And you don't expect it because you're expecting a realistic political story. And not only is it just, okay, the world is grim, things are terrible, people are depressing, politicians are always in for themselves, like Machiavelli would have wrote about if he existed in this world. Might makes right, basically. And you go in thinking that, and if you're like me, you're going to go in and see this story as vindication, as a wake-up call. And it sort of is, but not necessarily in that sense, because you go in like me and you're a cynic and you're being vindicated for your cynicism. You're seeing these terrible people do things not because they're trying to fulfill a prophecy, not because they're trying to do good for the world, but because they're trying to do good for themselves. Just like real life, a politician who's in it for themselves, who will imprison or kill somebody because that's what they want. That's something that will help them, not you, them. But then these people will turn around and pretend that they're on your side. They will do and say anything to keep their power on you. And that's the precedent George R. R. Martin sets until the story keeps going on. And you realize that there's actually more going on. And even though there's all these real world parallels, that it's very relatable, that it's so detailed and rich that you really feel like you're reading what George R. R. Martin calls an imaginary history, or an alternative history. It really feels like a genuine place because it's so deep and realistic. It feels so genuine. But slowly, more and more magic gets involved because we see the mainstay religion, the seven they're called, and we don't see their power in any circumstance. There's no like magic priests, there's no sorcerers or anything like that. But then the mysterious red god appears essentially through his priests like Melisandre, and slowly their magic seems to be real. They have prophecies, they have sites around the world. They do things that you don't that you can't really understand, that don't necessarily make sense. One character in particular, Beric Dondarrion, comes back from the dead because of this. And so there's all these little subversions of expectations. And yeah, like Tyler just said in the chat, when George R. R. Martin does this, it feels real. Like it feels authentic. It makes sense. So the thing about George R. R. Martin is you go in and you're a cynical person because you see the bad things of the world. You've read a history book, you've read philosophy, you know that people are terrible, that they do terrible things and they're self-serving, and that the only way to get through in this world is to be violent, is to be maybe not evil necessarily, but to do whatever is necessary to secure your own power. Because if you're not a king, then you're a pawn. And that's it. That's all there is, essentially. Chess doesn't actually work like that. Chess is much more complicated. But point is that you think that at first because it's so dark and despairing and there's no magic and it's essentially a wake-up call. At first it's a wake-up call for how terrible things are. But slowly, as you go through the story, more and more fantastic elements start to stick out. Like the fact that there is apparently an actual real God in the story. You would think that with this story being cynical, that there wouldn't be a God, that religion would just be a superstition, something to be mocked and derided, which you see plenty of in science fiction and in fantasy even. But George R. R. Martin doesn't do that. And he portrays R'hllor, the Red God, who, as far as I can tell, is the only true God in the story, except for maybe the Faceless God, which I think is sort of his opposite. But the point is that like the way that George represents the quote unquote one true God is in a way that would make sense for real life, if that makes sense. Essentially, because like if you look at real life and you say, okay, God is real, then you look at all these things which would be strange, and you say that's an act of God. So like uh give you a quick example, the story of Jesus feeding people in the Bible. What was it, 5,000, I think? Like that's not a big earth shattering kaboom. That's not like, that's not like flying on a giant eagle and dropping a ring in a mountain. That's not like that's not shooting laser beams or fireballs out of your hands and then doing whatever. That's a very small and simple thing comparatively. It's very meek and very subtle, in a sense. And that's the way George R. R. Martin represents God, essentially. I mean, obviously, you can argue that it's not exactly parallel, but he does something similar with his depiction of religions and deities. That they're not overt, they're not over the top. They're very subtle and in a very realistic way that you could see an actual, like, if in a way that would be relatable. Especially because in the stories, there is still a plausible deniability. Like, there's still a certain level of, okay, maybe this is still BS. Like, maybe there is such thing in magic, but maybe it's not true. Maybe it's some hoax or some superstition that got out of hand because these people have magic. It is possible. It doesn't explain things, but it is possible. And there's this pervasive sense of hope because you read through the story and you see all this terrible stuff going on, and you see all these characters you love dying, and all this merciless murder and slaughter and good or innocent people dying off, often in gruesome, torturous ways. But there's still always, and in fact, it grows stronger as the series goes on. There's always this little ray of hope that things are going to get better. The turning point for me really was reading the books, and there's a section where one of the Targaryens who's still alive, that's not Daenerys, he hears about Daenerys and her dragons, and he realizes, he's like, wait a minute, that prophecy that I have been told my whole life is coming true. He talks about this prophecy about this dragons coming back and essentially saving the world. Now, if you're going to write a story that's a realistic, political, low magic fantasy setting, you're not going to have a prophecy in there. It doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? That's not a political thing. That's not a fantasy thing, or at least not a low magic fantasy thing. George R. R. Martin does that, and it plays with your expectations. You weren't expecting it. So this is me rambling. Essentially what I'm getting at is that Song of Ice and Fire is brilliant because it starts off so dark, and you think that that's the point. You think that it's real life. You think that's what real life is. You think that real life is just people murdering each other and gaining power and manipulating each other and screwing their brothers and sisters and having all these conspiracies and all these weird superstitions. And then as the story goes on, there's this pervasive sense that all is going to balance itself out, that there is something causing justice in the world, that there is hope, and it's a little hope. It's not perfect necessarily. There are a lot of questions that go unanswered. There are a lot of good people that go bad, or there are a lot of good people that die. But there are also bad people that go good. There's people. My personal favorite character is Jaime Lannister. The absolute legend. One of the greatest characters. He starts off, he's just this complete douchebag. And then he becomes sympathetic. Very slowly. It's so gradual you don't even notice it at first. And then suddenly you're rooting for the guy. You love him. He's so great. That's George R. R. Martin. Not only is he so imaginative that he can make this fantasy world, and you read it and you're just, what? This is amazing. How did you come up with this? But he keeps. I'm sorry too. Tyler is sorry for what they did to Jaime Lannister. I'm sorry too. He keeps doing it too. Because every time you think you've got things figured out, he pulls the rug out from you. It's like he's reading your mind. It's mind-boggling how good he is at doing it. At least for me. Maybe not everyone gets that experience. But the fact that George R. R. Martin can write a story that's as realistic and depressing as it is, and can still make you feel good about it, instead of just wallowing in misery, that, more than anything, is the sign that he is a great author. That is his mark of quality. Because a lesser author who would write a sad story, a dark fantasy, realistic, political, low magic setting, probably would just suck. They would just be like, it basically be like an episode of South Park, except less funny. And that's saying a lot. So the fact that not only can George R. R. Martin can write this stuff and make it interesting, but can also add a layer on top of that where it just I can't even like word it. I can't even describe how good it is, how good the context of it is. I cannot talk about it enough. I am very envious of George R. R. Martin, and I am so envious of him that I will read his stories, I will read his books, and I will read the lore on Westeros. And I, as an aspiring writer, as an aspiring fantasy author, get depressed because I'm like, dang it, I don't think I can ever write anything this good. There's one particular line that really gets to me. It's always like little stuff that really bothers me when it comes to this sort of thing. There's there's two gods essentially, as far as we can tell, two real gods in Westeros. There's the Red God, who's the god of life and fire, and then there's the god of death, the nameless god, the god of shadows and cold and death and all that. Melisandre, who's a red priestess for the god of life and fire, R'hllor, talks about dreams. I'm going to see if I can find it actually. Um, okay. Yes. Okay. I don't know if this is ever in the show because it's just her thoughts in the book. Melisandre is thinking to herself, and she says, and it says, she had no time for sleep, with the weight of the world upon her shoulders, and she feared to dream. Sleep is a little death, dreams the whispers of the other, who would drag us all into his eternal night. Essentially saying that, like, the god of death whispers to you while you sleep, and that's like, so any dream that you have is like your own vision of hell, essentially, is what that's saying. And like that is such a cool idea that it's hard for me to talk about it and not swear. Because that, like, I look at that and I'm like, oh, I wish I could have written that. And I can't, you know. Sleep is a little, like every night you go to sleep and you die for like a couple hours and you dream, your dreams are like your premonition of hell. Like that's insane. Ugh. But what can you do? So, like I said, tonight was the last episode of Game of Thrones. I can't really recommend the show. I haven't watched a whole lot of it. They do characterize characters that don't really get a lot of attention in the books, like Shay, I think is her name. One of the characters has a prostitute that he loves, and in the book she's just a prostitute. In the show, however, she actually gets a little bit of backstory, which is, and it's actually fairly interesting. But anyways, that's not at all in the books, at least as far as I can tell. So I would definitely recommend. I I don't even know why I'm saying this. Anybody that's watching this has heard of the books, and is 100,000 times more likely to have read those than having not. But definitely read Song of Ice and Fire because it is so good. And I like, the thing is, like, when I first heard of Game of Thrones, I had no interest in it because I saw the trailers for it. I saw people make memes for it. I didn't see the trailers, that's a lie, but I saw people like talk about it and make memes. What I gleaned from all that was that Game of Thrones was Dungeons and Dragons meets Sex in the City, and that it was a show on HBO, and so everyone was like, they liked it because they're like, oh, look at how adult I am watching this show about people, having sex with one another, and then there's dragons in it. I really thought that's what it was because that was all people talked about was how violent it was and how like, oh, my favorite characters are dying. Oh, the show is so edgy, and like I was like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So I didn't want anything to do with it. How I ended up getting into it was I started to write my first book, not my first book, my current book, I should say, which is also a dark fantasy. And I was unemployed at the time. I had gotten a couple chapters into my first draft. I was unemployed, so I was bored out of my skull. I didn't want to do anything to get me in trouble. So I was at the library and I saw a copy of Game of Thrones look at me in the face, and I was like, ugh, ugh, and I tried to ignore it. But I was like, all right, fine, I'll read it. I fully expected to hate it, and I fell in love, like just like nothing. And these days I kind of struggle to read a lot. With those books, I just plowed through them. Like I could not get enough. It was so good. So don't let the reputation of the show daunt you. Don't let, people fool you. A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of maybe not so much Game of Thrones, but A Song of Ice and Fire is amazing. George R. R. Martin has been called the American Tolkien. He absolutely deserves that title. Absolutely deserves it. And all of us who want to be fantasy authors, especially dark fantasy authors, we're living in his shadow. Because when I started my current book, um, I got really depressed, and I was like, I'm never gonna make anything this good. Reading Game of Thrones, I was like, I can't do it, and I try not to let that get me down. But those books are so good that it is difficult for me to do that. Definitely read Game of Thrones. I'm gonna take a quick break because I need to calm down, or otherwise I'm just gonna nerd out about Game of Thrones for the rest of my life. Which, there are worse things to do in your time. Um, but I tell you what, I'm just gonna take a quick break. So, don't go anywhere, or if you do, uh, don't. Okay, I'm back. The Song of Ice and Fire is really good. The reason I brought it up, though, I completely forgot about this. The reason I brought it up is because as part of that whole spiel about pessimism, because you go in being very pessimistic, but there's this glimmer of hope that's so genuine that you don't expect. It applies to real life. You go through and you're thinking, in real life, you're thinking, maybe life is not so good. Maybe everything is just going to exploit you. And the fact that there's hope like this is a big deal. To have somebody there telling you that no matter what you believe, there is a hope, it's great. And part of the thing about Machiavelli and the Gray Monk, which we read, is that despite the grab for power, there are still genuine, heartfelt people that are willing to help you out, willing to work with you. And everyone has this preconceived notion that Song of Ice and Fire is supposed to be about violence, that it's about killing off your favorite characters and all this backstabbing, and that's only partly true. There's a lot more to it than that. Because, like I said, I thought it was Sex in the City meets Dungeons and Dragons. I thought it was just, Frank Franzetta cover with an HBO budget. Instead, what it is it's a glimmer of hope for your own life because you relate so much to it. It feels like history, even though it's not. Yeah, it is in some ways because it's based heavily on the War of the Roses, but the fact that there is that sense of hope, the fact that that in the series, kindness and virtue have more power ultimately than violence and power and ambition. The fact that they ultimately have more power than that speaks volumes about our own world, and we reflect on it and we realize that maybe, maybe it's not all so bad. Maybe you don't need to be violent to be successful, or maybe there's more to life than just anger and hatred and despair. Anyways, if I talk any more about Song of Ice and Fire, I think I'm probably just going to end up going in circles, but it's really good. It's so great. I honestly don't know like how anybody is capable of writing a series like that. Well, it's fun talking about that at least. Hmm. Well, I hate to, but I think I might actually just call it quits here. I think the ladies are gone. Probably went straight to bed, which is fine. 'Cause, you got to get your sleep in. Yeah, Tyler's gonna clock off too. And to be honest, I don't know if you could tell, I was mostly just pulling all that stuff out of my butt. But as much as I love rambling about uh, all this stuff, there's only so much you can do about it. So I think I'm just going to call it quits for tonight. It's only been an hour, but next week we'll be back. We'll start streaming an hour earlier. Um, Hopefully, I find something to talk about. And if not, we'll just talk more about nothing, which we love to do. Anyways, thank you for joining us or by listening to this. Again, give A Song of Ice and Fire a chance. It's really good. It's the best. It's so much better than the show. Um, Anyways, thanks for tuning in. Uh, have a good one. Good night.